record. Yeah, so anyway, we were going through this slide in chapter 13 PowerPoint, and this slide is basically looking at the different factors that we learn in chapter 13 with reference to what are the biological, psychological, and social contributing factors, as well as the treatments for specific phobia. So the ones that I'm going to put a green tick on, these are the evidence-based interventions that we learned about in the later part of chapter 13. The ones that I'm going to put a pink tick on, these are just the general contributing factors, the things that can contribute to the development of a specific phobia in the first place. Now, with reference to this first column here that says 4P factor model, 4P factor model is actually a topic that's not going to be assessed this year because it actually comes under chapter 12 when we look at the risk factors for a mental disorder. Now, because we completely skipped chapter 12, essentially you're not going to be asked to ever classify a factor or evaluate something with reference to the 4P factor model because it was simply a topic that was skipped. So as a whole topic, the 4P factor model will not be assessed this year. However, I do have to kind of give you a disclaimer that it is important for you to still know what the words precipitation and perpetuation mean with reference to chapter 13, specific phobia content. And this is because in chapter 13, when we learned about specific phobias, we learned about how classical conditioning precipitates or leads to the precipitation or development of a specific phobia. That's basically all you need to know with reference to that. When we talked about operand conditioning, we learned that operand conditioning and negative reinforcement and avoidance behaviors eventually lead to the perpetuation or the maintenance of a specific phobia. So you don't need to know the 4P factor model in depth, but you do need to understand that precipitation is another word for development. So when I say precipitation of specific phobia, it means development of specific phobia. And when I say perpetuation of specific phobia, it means the maintenance of a specific phobia. So that's essentially all you really need to know with reference to those two words. Now, with reference to this word protective, this should be quite, you can understand this just by looking at the word itself. The word protective means something that protects you against developing a disease or some kind of condition. So when we talk about protective factors, we obviously are talking about the evidence-based interventions or treatments for specific phobia, but we are also talking about other things that people can do to protect their mental health in general. So all of the things we learned about in chapter 14, like having an adequate diet, drinking enough water, having an adequate sleep, those are also protective factors. Okay, so protective factors is just any factor that protects you from developing a condition or a disease. So that's basically what that is. Now, predisposing factors, we know that predisposing is when you're predisposed to something. Usually we refer back to it as relating to genetics, so like genetic predisposition. Again, you don't need to know the 4P factor model, but the problem is, even though Vika have said that we're not supposed to know the 4P factor model, the words from the 4P factor model or those key terminologies do come up in other parts of the chapters that we do need to know, like chapter 13 and chapter 14. So just to clarify, that's basically what you need to understand. But we're not going to ask you in the SAC, or you're not going to be asked in the exam, which type of factor as per the 4P factor model is stigma. Okay, you're not going to be asked to like classify it like that. Okay, so just know what the words mean, like what I've shown you here, what these words mean with reference to specific phobia and mental health, and that's about it. You're not going to be asked further than that. I hope that clarifies that question. So let me just go back and see what other stuff we have. Slide 10, chapter 13. Okay, so slide 10, chapter 13. So this is 18, so 17, 16, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10. Okay, so I'm presuming you're talking about this. So psychological contributing factors. So these are just the factors that contribute to an increased risk of developing a specific phobia. So when we're talking about how somebody develops a specific phobia or how they maintain a specific phobia, these are the psychological contributing factors, essentially talking about what kind of a role do our thoughts and our learning processes and our memories play in us either developing a phobia or continuing to live with a phobia. Okay, so that's basically what the psychological contributing factors are. Now, we've got 3 contributing factors that we look at with reference to specific phobias. Now, whenever you see the word contributing factor, you need to know that that simply means what is a factor that contributes to the development of a specific phobia. So when we're talking about, like, if I ask you in a SAC, or if you're asked in an exam situation to identify, okay, or explain the role of one psychological contributing factor in the development of a specific phobia. If it doesn't specify which one, you can choose any. You can decide to talk about the precipitation by classical conditioning. You can decide to talk about perpetuation by Operand conditioning. You can decide to talk about any of the cognitive biases that we've learned, like memory bias or catastrophic thinking. So that's what the word contributing factor means. And it's very important for you to know the differentiation between these key question terms, okay? Because if I'm asking you for a psychological contributing factor, it's very different from me asking you to outline a psychological evidence-based intervention, okay? One is asking you for what are the factors that contribute to the actual development of the condition, and then the other question would be asking you to explain psychological treatments or interventions available to address that condition once the person has developed that condition in its entirety. So that's essentially the difference, okay? And you need to be able to read a question and highlight or understand or pinpoint what exactly that question is asking you. Because if you just assume that the question about contributing factors is asking you about an evidence-based intervention, and you start talking about some evidence-based intervention like systematic desensitization or something like that, you're going to automatically lose the full maybe 3 or 4 marks for that question, because you haven't taken heed of what is actually in the question and what the question is asking you. So you have to be very careful and understand the different headings that are in these PowerPoints, because depending on which heading we ask you about, you have to give us the information relevant to that. So anyway, moving straight into the psychological contributing factors. So we know that specific phobias are developed through principles of operant conditioning, okay? So developed means precipitation. So when we talk about how does a phobia precipitate, we're basically explaining how does a phobia develop, okay? How is it established or developed in the first place? And remember that when we looked at a question about this, oh, sorry, we haven't looked at a question about it yet, but when we look at a question about this tomorrow, when we go through the solutions to the practice set, I'm going to tell you that actually one of the marks for this, for the question about precipitation by classical conditioning comes from you simply unpacking what the word precipitation means. And that is you basically saying that precipitation means that the phobia is either established or developed through classical conditioning principles. So that's basically what we're talking about. Okay, so obviously when we learned about classical conditioning in outcome 2, sorry, in unit 3, we looked at all these different terms like neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus, all that stuff. So you will be expected to talk about those terms and to use that classical conditioning terminology, to use the language of classical conditioning when you write your response. Okay, so for example, if I'm going to use little Albert's scenario here and kind of just run through that. Now, little Albert initially, when he was confronted with the white rat, he was happy. He wasn't showing any crying or any fear response. He was just neutral, okay? The white rat was kind of scurrying around the room, climbing on top of little Albert's kind of, body. Little Albert didn't care. He didn't show any fear, okay? Babies or humans are not naturally conditioned to fear rats, okay? It's just some people develop phobias of them, but that again is conditioned. It's not natural. So how did little Albert then develop a phobia of rats? There was, first of all, a repeated association between a UCS, which is something that would naturally cause fear in a person. So when little Albert hears the loud noise that he doesn't expect, because obviously they kind of make this noise behind his head, so he can't actually see that they're about to make the noise, he gets scared each time. So that's the UCS. Now, there's a repeated association between the UCS and the NS, okay? And that repeated association is shown here in the square box. So there's a repeated association between the UCS, something that would naturally cause fear in any person consistently, and a neutral stimulus, which is something that never actually caused a response in the first place. It's a neutral stimulus. So essentially, when these are repeatedly associated over 1 time, 2 time, 3 time, 4 trials, 5 trials, 6 times, whatever, okay, repeated association eventually leads to that neutral stimulus going from being a neutral stimulus causing no response to becoming a stimulus that actually causes a response, okay? And this stimulus that changes the neutral stimulus is called the conditioned stimulus. And remember, the word conditioned stimulus in specific phobia terminology is another word for phobic stimulus. So when we say that this person has a specific phobia of snakes, it means that their phobic stimulus, aka their conditioned stimulus that they're scared of, is a snake. Okay, so in any situation, in any scenario, the conditioned stimulus is the phobic stimulus. And now the conditioned stimulus produces a fear response, which is our conditioned response, okay? And this conditioned response is going to be fear due to the white rat, so due to the phobic stimulus. So this is the phobia, essentially. The actual fear response that we see is the conditioned response. The actual phobic stimulus that causes that fear response is the conditioned response, or the phobic stimulus. That is the thing that the person is scared of. So you got a specific phobia of birds, your phobic stimulus, aka your conditioned stimulus, is birds. Okay, and then your CR will be fear due to birds. You've got a phobic stimulus of, I don't know, cars. Your phobic, you've got a phobia of cars. Your phobic stimulus will be a car. Okay, and your, obviously because of that, your conditioned stimulus is also going to be a car. So remember how in unit 3 I said that conditioned stimulus always equals to neutral stimulus, like in terms of how you write it. If we're going to add an extra thing to this, we can say that, yep, a neutral stimulus is the conditioned stimulus in terms of how I write it in my answer, and the conditioned stimulus is the phobic stimulus, so PS. Okay, they're all exactly the same thing. Yes, I hope that makes sense. It's just about the repeated association and that process. Okay, you can use the 3-phase process to explain this, but you're usually not required to do that, as long as you understand the general process of how phobias are developed through classical conditioning. That repeated association between the UCS and a stimulus that was originally neutral to produce the conditioned stimulus, and then the conditioned stimulus produces the conditioned phobic fear response.
Miss, we don't have
the
to
next
explain
part.
the whole process.
Sorry?
We don't have to explain the whole process here.
What do you mean by the
NS?
like what I just explained?
NS, yeah, like NS, neutral stimulus, and UCS and stuff.
Yes, you do need to explain that.
So when they ask us about explain precipitation by classical conditioning, we have to
So if
explain
they give you a scenario of a person who's developed like a phobia of something, and in that scenario, it will read pretty much like a classical conditioning scenario that you did in unit 3. So after you've read that, you need to then determine what are the different elements in that scenario, and then just talk about how the phobia was developed. So how the two factors or two elements were repeatedly associated, and then how the NS became the CS, and then how the CS then led to the CR. So you kind of do have to talk about everything. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, we're going to go through a sample response, and I'm going to break this down for you tomorrow. But you kind of, at the end of the day, do have to kind of bring in all the elements together.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Then we're talking about perpetuation by operant conditioning. So this is the second psychological contributing factor. So let's say now I've got the phobia. I'm scared of birds. I've got a specific phobia of birds. I can either decide to confront my fear, or I can decide to, you know what, just avoid birds for the rest of my life. If I avoid birds for the rest of my life, I am maintaining my specific phobia because I'm not getting any closer to recovering from it. Because avoidance behavior leads to the maintenance of perpetuation, of specific phobias, we say that perpetuation in very simple words means maintenance. Okay, so when I say perpetuation of a specific phobia by operant conditioning, I am referring to how somebody can maintain their specific phobia through operant conditioning principles. What do we mean by operant conditioning principles? Well, we're talking about the concept of negative reinforcement. Okay, so if we're engaging in avoidance behavior, it's always negative reinforcement that's going to be having a role there. So if I'm scared of birds and, you know, I live in an area where there's a lot of birds, I am not going to leave my house very often. I'm going to be avoiding leaving my house. And by avoiding birds, I am removing something negative. I'm removing an unpleasant stimulus of potentially confronting those birds. And that brings me relief. That brings me a good feeling. And so because it brings me a good feeling, I'm going to be likely to again engage in that avoidance behavior. And because I'm again engaging in that avoidance behavior, and that's strengthening the recurrence or the repetition of that avoidance behavior, that would be an example of negative reinforcement. Okay. Now, obviously, we did talk about like how positive reinforcement can have a role, but positive reinforcement more has a role in terms of trying to change the specific phobia altogether. So it's not extremely relevant when we're talking about perpetuation, because perpetuation is simply referring to how we maintain the specific phobia. So remember, whenever you see avoidance behavior, there's only one explanation for avoidance behavior with reference to operant conditioning, and that explanation is negative reinforcement. Do not talk about positive reinforcement with reference to avoidance behavior. That's not correct. Okay, so that's basically the link between those two concepts there. So yeah, this is just a slide that again summarizes the two. So specific phobias are developed through classical conditioning, or precipitated is that key word, and specific phobias are perpetuated or maintained through operant conditioning. And that's the general process that we see. And you should be able to explain that, and we'll do a question tomorrow that explains how that works and looks at a solution breakdown. This is a phobia of the dentist. So, you know, again, it's showing you how there's a repeated association, and we're really concerned about what happens in these two stages here, in the during conditioning and the after conditioning. Okay, obviously, even if we're just concerned with these two, we still have to bring up what the UCS is, because again, when we're during the conditioning phase, when the specific phobia is being developed, there is a repeated association between the dentist and pain. So let's say the dentist gives an injection into your gum to do some dental procedure, okay? And generally going to the dentist or seeing the dentist shouldn't cause fear in somebody, but because of the repeated association between seeing the dentist or going to the dental clinic and remembering the pain from that injection and how your gums started bleeding or started bruising or swelling up, okay, that eventually, that repeated association, which might have occurred over a few dental visits or over a few times, eventually leads to the NS, which was originally the neutral stimulus of going to the dentist, becoming the conditioned stimulus. So now the fear that you originally placed because of the injection, that fear has now been transferred to the actual dentist himself or to the actual dental clinic itself. So the CS, or the phobic stimulus in this case, would be the visit to the dentist, and the conditioned response, or the actual phobia in this case, would be the fear due to the dentist. Okay, so just, it's all about identifying what the UCS and NS are, then talking about how the NS becomes the CS, and then how the CS produces the CR. Okay, that's basically all it is. How does operant conditioning play a role here? Well, obviously, if I need to go to the dentist, but I somehow avoid it, or I say, oh, you know, I can't go today, I'm not feeling well, or I've got an important SAC coming up. By avoiding the dentist, by avoiding that unpleasant injection, yes, you are getting some kind of a comfort and relief there, like, phew, I was able to avoid going to the dentist today. That's going to act as negative reinforcement, okay, because it's going to strengthen the likelihood that in the future, you are also not going to go to the dentist, even though you very much have to the next time that possibility comes up. Okay, it's all about the relief. Okay, we love comfort, we love to feel relief, we don't like to feel discomfort. No one likes to step out of their comfort zone, and people with specific phobia are no different. In fact, people with specific phobia are extremely addicted to staying within their comfort zone. They do not want to even entertain the possibility that they could you know, be going to the dentist, or that they could encounter a bird on their walk, or they could see a car if they were to step outside, obviously depending on what phobia they have. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense, and that basically covers our psychological contributing factors. The cognitive bias part is pretty simple. Cognitive biases are just faulty ways in which people think that don't represent realistic or logical thought. And there's only two biases that we need to know according to our study design, and they're memory bias and catastrophic thinking. So memory bias is that when you are asked to think about things that have happened to you in the past with reference to your specific phobia. If I've got a specific phobia of birds, and someone says, okay, tell me about, you know, your experiences with birds. Why are you so scared of them? The first thing I say is, oh my God, when I was 10 years old, a bird, you know, a magpie swooped over me and pecked my head, and it was the worst thing. And then this other thing happened where a magpie stole my chips, or I don't know, something like that. So essentially you're remembering all the negative or threatening information, rather than thinking about the information that is probably harmless. Like all the times I had a walk in the park and no bird ever pounced on me. Pounce, that's not the correct word, but no bird ever swooped over me. or all the neutral times when I was, maybe going out on a trip and there weren't any birds that attacked me. Okay, so memory bias is your tendency to recall bad memories relating to the specific phobic stimulus rather than good memories or neutral memories. Catastrophic thinking is like the way that specific phobia people think, that is indicative of a lot of exaggeration, a lot of worst case scenario. So when you think, oh my God, if I go outside, a bird is going to swoop over my head and is going to peck my brains out, and I'm not going to be able to finish my VCE, I'm not going to be able to go to uni, get a degree, get married, I'm just going to die on the spot and there goes my entire life legacy. That is catastrophic thinking. Okay, that's like, whoa, catastrophe. Okay, that's where the word comes from. So that's like the worst case scenario. Okay, so that's basically, and obviously if you engage in these kinds of thinking, they can add to your anxiety, they can exacerbate your anxiety and make your anxiety worse. And in doing so, they can increase the chances that you either develop a specific phobia or your specific phobia that you already have becomes much, much, much more worse and more difficult for you to manage. Alrighty, so those are the 3 psychological contributing factors. Now let me go back to the chat box and see what other topics we have to cover. Why hasn't anyone written any other topics for me to cover? So are we all good with all the other topics in that case? I am assuming so. All right, so like I said before, yes, let's see. So as I said before, what's it called? Just make sure you're clear with the way that these, if you're using your study design to make your notes and you are actively using that, that's good, because the terminology in the study design, for example, like I said before, things like, for example, if we ask you a question on a contributing factor, a biological contributing factor, if you've written that it like that in your notes and that's your heading and you've got these 3 topics underneath that, that's good because you've organized your information, okay, in your memory or in your brain, you've organized that content accordingly to the key term. So straight away when you read that question, you're like, yep, the SAC is asking me to talk about one of these, role of stress response, GABA dysfunction, role of LTP. You straight away know what the question expects from you. Okay, whether that's in a SAC or whether that's in an exam situation. So be very careful to know what the differentiation is between these keywords or key headings in each of the topics, not just in chapter 13, but in all the topics. For example, if we ask you for a characteristic of a mentally healthy person that we learned about in chapter 11, you should give me something like high levels of functioning or social well-being or emotional well-being or resilience. Okay, if we ask you for a protective factor for mental health, you should think about, in general, there are a lot of protective factors, but there are specific ones that we learn about in chapter 14, like adequate diet, adequate sleep, resilience to life stresses, all that kind of stuff. So just make sure that you are not just learning the content and having that in a big jumble in your brain, but organizing that content according to the headings of your study design. And if you go through the notes that are posted on the school box or even through the PowerPoint, we always kind of create these in a way that is following the study design or adhering to the terminology from the study design. So make sure you are familiar with those keywords and key question command terms. Okay, so obviously question command terms, if it's a 1-mark question and we've just asked you to list something, you just have to list it in 1 or 2 words. You don't have to write me an essay and waste like a lot of time. Okay, if it's worth 2 marks and it says to describe, you have to describe. But again, if it's only worth 2 marks, you don't have to write a whole lot of information. If it's a 4-mark question or 3-mark question, yes, you do have to give a little more information. If it's an evaluate question, you have to give me a strength or a weakness or an advantage or a disadvantage. Okay, so just being wary of those question command terms and really understanding what the question is asking you. If we ask you for 2 factors, 2 psychological contributing factors, and you give me 3, I'm only going to mark the first 2. Okay, and that's how VCAR assessors also mark. You can't just give them a list of information and expect them to pick out which one is correct. They're only going to mark the first 2 or the first 3, whatever amount they require, and they just ignore the rest of them. So just make sure you are addressing that question and adhering to that question specifically and the requirements of that question. Okay, so I still don't see any extra topics in chat box. So I think, okay, I think we're okay then. Hopefully, if you've got any other questions, of course, you can just ask me through email or even tomorrow before we start going through the practice SAC solutions. We can do that as well. I think we can probably, I don't know, what do you guys think? I'll just stop the recording here first thing.